Welcome to Yoga is Science, the podcast where Western medicine meets Eastern philosophy. I'm Colynn Vosburgh, a former emergency room nurse and medical student turned full-time yoga teacher. With over 200 teacher trainings taught, I've come to understand how yoga really is the original science of life. And I'd love you to join me as we explore the profound ways that ancient wisdom and modern science intersect to support healing, growth, and transformation. Let's dive in. Hey, welcome everybody to the first episode of Yoga is Science. I sat and wondered, what is it that I'm going to talk about? How am I going to start this? I need to let everybody know who I am, just so that you know that I have the rights to share this. And what comes up for me is the idea that I have so many stories that I'll share as we go along. And I don't need to make a whole episode telling you who I am, because there are many of you that already know me, and many that don't, but you will get to know me. And so I thought it would be actually really perfect to dive into all the topics that I have based on almost like I'm running a yoga teacher training. Because what's happened for me is my experience of teacher training myself, right? I remember I had signed up, I'd paid, it was time to dive in, and my teacher said on our Facebook group, pretty soon it's going to be life before yoga teacher training and life after teacher training. And I thought, okay, like how dramatic. And then 4 months later, it's time to graduate. And I remember I stood up and I said, it really is life before teacher training and life after teacher training. And that first weekend that I arrived, I had actually been accepted into medical school and had tried to leave teacher training and wasn't able to get a refund. And therefore, when I came, I was like, listen, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm not here to teach yoga. And when I left, I had recognized that going to med school was not the answer, being a doctor was not the answer, and that this really was what I wanted to share with people. So it was a profound time, and it really did become life before teacher training and life after teacher training. Now, I've taught well over 200 teacher trainings. And one of the key things that I know from the personal development world, even from going to med school, is that repetition is key for understanding. And when I say something to you the first time, it lands. But when I repeat it over and over again, it's not just a word that comes into your consciousness. You actually start to understand the meaning and the deeper meaning beyond the word. And the more that it's repeated, the deeper understanding that you'll get. So the basis of yoga is science is that I kept teaching in teacher trainings that yoga is the science of life. Yoga is the science of life. And I was like saying those words, but internally, being a scientist, having a degree in science, I would kind of like laugh about it because it's not really science. Like my degree shows you what science is, not yoga. Yet one day I was repeating how yoga is science, and I was diving into science from a Western perspective. And previous lessons that I had taught and research came into mind, in which I realized like yoga is 5 to 10,000 years old, right? It's the oldest documented religion or belief out there. And we're talking about 10,000 years ago. That's long before microscopes, long before antibiotics, long before science degrees or medical degrees. And what I had learned was in order for these gurus or these monks to create these systems of our energy and like understanding the body is that they didn't take apart dead bodies to see how people worked. No, they studied live bodies. Because in the East, right, what happens when someone passes is the body is burnt. The body is not desecrated. The body is not put with formaldehyde and several other things to preserve. It literally is burnt. And the ashes, if you're lucky, are put in a certain river that can be very cleansing and help the soul to pass. If we were to cut the body apart and do other things, that's seen as desecration. That actually makes it so that the body doesn't necessarily pass over, or the soul or the spirit or whatever goes on in that. So I realized, like, oh my gosh, these people did not dissect cadavers such as I did in med school. These people did not get understanding by cutting this open and like holding a brain in their hands. What they did without the distractions of Netflix and social media scrolling and the radio was like these people actually like looked at people and sat with people and worked with their own intuition and recognizing bodies as energy, recognizing the fluids, the air, the molecules that went through the body were actually atoms, energy moving. And therefore, they studied live bodies. In order to see how someone breathed, they studied a live body. So, how would one explain digestion if they never saw digestion? And it hit me, oh, this is 10,000-year-old Eastern science. And it actually lines up with what modern day Western science. And that's when things really shifted for me because I did my teacher training literally to be better at yoga. I wanted to know the poses better. I came in with the lineage of Iyengar, so very alignment based, lots of props. So I already had actually, I didn't even know a better understanding of the practice, the asanas, the poses, and many of the breath practices and meditation more than people that went to a studio because people attending studios were really going to just move their bodies quickly and breathe heavy and sweat and call it a workout. And so when I went into teacher training, I started to realize this. I had already been a nurse for many, many years, 14 years. I was already attending like anatomy workshops because I loved to see how the body moved, where restrictions came from, and then how to integrate that into my own practice based on injuries that I had. And what came up within teacher training was like how much more yoga actually was than just the postures that I saw. And while I did get better at postures and I learned how to do crow and I could hold a plank way stronger, I also learned about energetics like the chakra system and I learned about the koshas and I learned about the sutras. But I also thought those things were kind of stupid. And so I pushed past them. I was like, yeah, that's woohoo weird stuff. And I moved on to like what I thought was important, which was like the anatomy of yoga and the asanas, and that's great. It wasn't until I was creating workshops. So I really, by the time I left, I decided I don't want to go to med school anymore. I don't want to be a nurse anymore. I want to teach yoga. And I had approached my teacher and said to her, listen, I want to do this, but like when I'm done med school as an emergency room physician, I'll be making a minimum of $20,000 per month. So, like, you can't make that as a yoga teacher. And the way she said it was like, listen, all you need to do is come up with a number and then make that number. And there was something about the way she said it that I thought, maybe I could do this. And I didn't quit med school or nursing right then and there. I actually made the conscious decision to create a business and to build that business to the point to prove to myself that I could do that. And then eventually I would leave those things, which is essentially what happened. I spent 2 years building a yoga business, bringing up, I was to a point where I was making about $5,000 a month teaching yoga. I was also going to med school and I was also still working full time as a nurse. So it did come to a point where now my yoga money was equivalent with my nursing money. And I was making more money than I had really ever made unless I went, I think one time I went travel nursing and I just worked straight for the whole month and I made about $12,000. And so I thought, wow, I could do this. And I still worked a lot, but if I left nursing, then I could replace all the hours I'm working at nursing by teaching yoga. And this really could happen. And if I wasn't also going to med school at the same time, I could probably take a lot of the time that I was learning in school and apply that to teaching, and I could make 20 grand. I thought I could make it happen. And I did, and I moved forward, and I ended up quitting all of those things, which led me into the career that I now have. I mean, there was more than just teaching yoga, right? Teaching yoga brought me in like $32 a class. So even if I was teaching 20 classes per week, which was well over 40 hours a week, it still was nowhere close to what I was making or what I could make as a doctor. So I needed to come up with other ways to make money teaching yoga. And one of the first things I offered was a program or a workshop called the Intro to Chakras. And the chakras got me because they aligned very well with what was happening in med school at the time. I remember I had a virtual patient in med school, and I was to like examine him and diagnose him and find out, I could order blood work, I could do all these things. And he had hyperthyroid. And then at the same time, within my days as a medical student in the emergency room, as well as a nurse in the emergency room, I was getting confronted with person after person after person after person with either hypothyroid or hyperthyroid. And what we know is that the thyroid gland is in the throat and it is related to the throat chakra. And I was reading a book by Anna Dea Judith, and I was creating this workshop. And she started speaking to the fact that any of the chakras, which is where gurus would see like a spinning vortex of energy. So they would see that that was where there was extra energy kind of circulating within the body. That from a Western perspective is actually where there was nerve plexuses or plexuses of nerves that came together. So now we've got Eastern philosophists that can see the energy in someone's body and where it's concentrated. And then we have Western medical practitioners that also know how the nerves run, that there's energy and electrical signals going through those nerves, and that there are concentrated areas of nerves, therefore electrical signals, therefore energy, in these same places in which the yogis thought there were chakras. I think, the fact that there was seven and they're the color of the rainbow, but there's more, but we don't know anything about them. Like all of the philosophical kind of jargon that was in it didn't really attract me. But when I heard a scientist break it down and speak from a science perspective, I now understood a little bit more about how, first and foremost, the chakras didn't even have colors assigned to them until like the 70s. How do you like that? Because some man decided that he was going to make money through selling the chakras, so some cultural appropriation. And there was 8 main chakras. So we had to get rid of one, right? In order for them to align with the colors of the rainbow. Now, he wasn't wrong because he took the densest color, the color of red, and made it or associated it with the densest chakra, or the root chakra. And that's fine. So it's not like it's not true, but in order to align these perfectly aligned chakras, they had to get rid of the bindu, which was a chakra located at the back of the head because it didn't fit in with the color scheme. So when I started to learn more and more about how we had butchered a very ancient religion or understanding or science of life, then I could buy more into this practice. And the more that I taught, the more that I repeated these lessons, the more I started to understand and make connections between these philosophies as I thought of them that were actually science, and then to modern day science, which is what this podcast is all about. And we'll start by looking at like these very basic fundamental teachings within a yoga teacher training. And then we'll dive in deeper and deeper and we'll start having guests, etc. But really, we're going to start with these core learnings that I was taught that I kind of thought, okay, and dove into. So while we're here, why don't we start with the history of yoga? Now, there are so many different accounts of the history of yoga, so I'm not really going to involve dates because I don't want us to focus necessarily on like at 1350 BC this happened, but rather the steps in which what we now know as postmodern yoga came to be. Right. So the idea is that yoga is about 5 to 10,000 years old. And prior to anything being written down, yoga was passed on through voice. Right. Anyone that spoke Sanskrit knew yoga. Now, Sanskrit is also supposed to be the first language prior to Latin. Anything that I say here, this is what I've learned, and this is what I'm passing on. Here's one thing that you're not going to get from me. I'm not 10,000 years old. I am not actually, or this physical body that I know with the memory that I have is not 10,000 years old. And in no way do I stand in a conviction so strongly that I would argue with people like I know, like I was there. One of the questions that I encourage you to ask yourself is why? And I encourage you not only to ask yourself, but I encourage you to ask your teachers. Because as a teacher of teachers that has taught many, many things to many, many people, I get pushback. And when I get pushback, I mean, first and foremost, cool. I don't care, believe whatever you want. That works for me. Half of that problem is that we believe it just because somebody told us. And so, where's the conviction in knowing the truth in that? Just because somebody told you, just because your teacher told you so. Where did your teacher find that out? Oh, their teacher. And where did their teacher find it out? Right? Oh, and where did their teacher find it out? What I know, based on watching multiple documentaries about multiple Indian gurus, is that many people that came over to the West from the East came full of shit. They came over, we're talking like what, the Bikram came over telling you that he knew all these things, he was sharing and he had stolen it all. I just watched the Breath of Fire documentary of, unfortunately, Yogi Bhajan, who was full of shit, who brought over teachings that weren't even necessarily yogic, but Sikh, and started teaching that. And a bunch of people didn't ask any questions. They just followed, they put turbans on their head, and they went ahead and did their own thing. I also think about, Osho. Right? There's a great documentary on Osho and exactly what it is that he did when he brought teachings over here, teachings that I think come from a very grounded place, but after getting to a cult mentality and having all this power, went way off the rails. So what we know is a lot from those teachers. These are people that came over here that, I mean, Yogi Bhajan himself came over here avoiding a woman that he got pregnant and then teaching us moral conduct. right? We've got Bikram coming here and assaulting people. A lot of these people assaulted other people in order to spread a message. And while I have connected to many of those messages, the carriers are out of integrity. And so it calls in a lot of question of the teachings that we're passing on, right? I myself am a white woman that learned yoga in Canada, right? And went ahead and have passed on all that I have learned based on a more grounded and scientific foundation. But also, I just want to know, like, who's to say what I'm teaching is right? So, me, because what I'm teaching is right for me. And what I'm teaching comes from studies. And what I'm teaching comes from knowledge of the human body. And what I'm teaching comes from what feels right to me. And what I'm teaching has been not altered, but shifted from Eastern philosophy into a Western world. And therefore, I have a why. If you ask me why, I have an answer for you. I know where I got it from. I know which book I've read it from. I know what research I did in order to arrive at these conclusions, which also includes like teaching and just having a deeper embodied understanding in my own body and my own mind. And therefore, I'll always have a why. It's not just going to be because my teacher told me. And so I encourage you when you have question to ask, and I encourage you to ask that question, why, which is also why I'm not going to stand 100% convicted in my beliefs as true. My beliefs are based on research, science, and many, many trainings, and they fit, and I understand where they're coming from. But it's not a place where I'm so convicted that I'm going to fight somebody else to come to like a death duel to tell you that I'm right. I just know from a functional perspective in an aspect of the body, what I offer is experiential practice. And so if I say joint stacking is healthy for the body, what I'm going to do is get you down into a posture in which you're joint stacking. And then I'm going to get you to engage the appropriate muscles, and I'm going to ask you how you feel in this pose. And then I'm going to get you into a pose that's similar, but not joint stacking, more aesthetic. And then I'm going to ask you how you feel. And I'm going to get you to engage your muscles as much as you possibly can. And you're going to notice the differences in your body and what feels right for you. And then you're going to choose what works for you. So I want to own all of those things is a way that I have learned and also taught. I have never taken anybody's word just because they told me. I went back and I researched and I looked it up and I read books and I dove deeper and deeper and deeper to come to an answer that felt very grounded, stable, and backed up. So when we get into yoga, that's why I'm not going to argue about the days because you can look and see that there's many different ideas of these days. But what I know is there's like a chronological order in the way that things happen. And that can be a really expansive view with many, many different perspectives. And it can be a little bit more of a narrowed view. And so where does yoga come from? It's 5 to 10,000 years old. What we know is it's anyone that spoke Sanskrit learned yoga. What we know now is that those that spoke Sanskrit were either monks or royalty. And that's it. Those were the only people that had access to the teachings of yoga. And we're talking olden day times, right? Where sacrifice was still a thing. And the word yoga doesn't even really make its way into, I guess you could call it mainstream culture until one of the first books arrives. And these books are called the Vedas. And one of the books is called the Rig Veda. And within the Rig Veda comes the word yoga. And yoga essentially translates to yoke, which then further translates into like yoga yokes into everything. So yoga kind of is everything. That's several people's interpretation. Do I speak Sanskrit? I mean, I can repeat some, but I don't actively speak Sanskrit. And therefore, I can only take the word of many translators. So, yoga still, though, we're not even talking asana until many, 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 many moons later, right? Yoga is about sacrifice. Yoga has mantras and practices and different things that people participate in order to live their life as a religion or an organized way of life that will bring like happiness and life and health and vitality and those kind of things. So as we move through the idea now of writing down or documenting, we move from the Vedas into the Upanishads. And the Upanishads really look at very similar things, but rather than like sacrificing animals or virgins, we're looking at sacrificing the ego. We're looking at becoming aware of the fact that we misidentify and learning and diving deeper into our own self by sacrificing that misidentification as body or mind. We dive a little bit deeper. We move into the Mahabharata, Maha translating to like great. So the text of Mahabharata is translated into the Great One. Apparently, it's one of the biggest books in the world. I don't know this 100% to be true. That my teacher told me, and that I never looked up to see the truth of it. It includes many different chapters, also known as Gitas. Right? Maybe you're now like, oh, wait, I've heard some of these words before. The Rig Veda, Upanishads, the Gita, namely the Bhagavad Gita, which is one chapter in the entire Mahabharata. So it's said a lot of this is based in mythology. It's said that actually Ganesh is the scribe of the Mahabharata. Ganesh is brought back as the Ganesh, a god, an elephant-headed god, is brought back as Ganapati, which is god of the people. And he is paired with a saint to learn all of this ancient wisdom. And so he's, put with this saint who's going to teach him everything. But the saint says, I'm only going to teach you everything if I can start talking and you write down everything. And we don't stop until I'm done. And Ganesh says, okay. And so the saint starts speaking and Ganesh starts writing, and it continues for 2 straight years. Okay. I'm talking about like over 700 days later. During that time, even Ganesh is writing and the pen breaks and he has no more ink. And so he breaks his own tusk out off, dips it in the ink, and continues to scribe by using his own tusk. And so there's several Gitas. There's many different stories within the Gita, but one of the stories that is very famous is the Bhagavad Gita. Jay Shetty speaks of it because he himself was a monk. When anyone participates in the ISKCON movement, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, what we know is that the Bible for them is the Bhagavad Gita, and they know it in Sanskrit. I've sat with so many ISKCONs, so many Hare Krishnas, and have heard them recite any part of the book by memory in Sanskrit. And it's amazing and incredible. And so, there's so many different branches that come off from these different little points in chronology as we're going through, and different eras of yoga as well as we move. But as we continue from the Mahabharata, there's an introduction to something called Tantra Yoga. And Tantra Yoga now is like known as some weird sex cult, but like it's not. there is this idea that in order for you to save your energy, you need to save your sexual energy. And Tantra speaks of Mahadevi, the great goddess, as opposed to the male gods, and says instead of saving yourself and never masturbating or touching yourself or having sex, what if you use sex, which is the greatest energy to use to get in touch with God? What if we use it in partnership to get closer to God? What if we use the greatest enjoyment that we can feel in our bodies to get to God? What if that is God? And so enter Tantra. And as I said, Tantra is known for some weird sex scandal, but it's really not about that. That branched off into whatever, branches there are. And also, there's still Tantra. When Tantra says there's like no good, there's no evil, there is. And as we continue down the line, eventually we get the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. There is question whether this is just one man or several men that came together. Remember, there are no women practicing. None of the monks are women. The royalty that get access to these teachings are not women. They're all men. And so women are not allowed to practice yoga in any of this. Every once in a while, we meet or have a story of a woman, but really the idea is that that soul is more of a male soul incarnated in a woman. They made a mistake. And there are these one-offs, but a lot of people, even those women that do become gurus, they really had a hard time making their way up to prove that they were worthy of their guru status. So now we have the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Patanjali or Patanjali, however you want to pronounce that, is the person that started to make yoga more accessible, right? No householders are practicing yoga because nobody speaks Sanskrit. And what he notices is like, listen, if you follow these 8 limbs or these 8 steps, you will actually create a meaningful and purposeful life. And so they get together and they write down the 8 limbs of yoga, and they write down what 297 aphorisms for you to get to a space where you can live a happy life that is meaningful. And as we continue, right, things start to make it from just being men and royalty and monks is like actually it starts to get its way into householders. A side note that's not often taught is that we now start to have Buddhas popping up in Southeast Asia. These are people not from India that are learning yoga because they are royalty. Gautama Buddha was a king. He was a king that when he was a child, his dad took like all of the sick, the infirm, the elderly out of town whenever he was around, and to prevent suffering from him knowing that there's anything bad in the world. And one day he sneaks out and he goes into town and he sees suffering. He sees elderly, he sees poor, he sees disease. And that really messes with him. And so as he's learning yoga because he's royalty. And he starts to see the division of royalty and class, and he doesn't understand it. And so he ends up actually like getting married, having a baby, and then abandoning everyone, abandoning his post as king, and heading out into India and hanging out with, the homeless homies of yoga, in which he learns like a deeper understanding. He finds out about enlightenment. He sits below the Bodhi tree. He says, I'm not going to move for 40 days and 40 nights. Well, no, he says, I'm not going to move until I reach enlightenment. And he's there for 40 days and 40 nights. And he's taking care of the whole time. He doesn't get up to go, but he's still fed. He's still, many things happen. There's many off stories that I can tell around that. But then Buddha starts to take yoga to the people. So yoga is for the elite and Buddhism is for the broke. And Buddhism is like now dubbed like poor yoga. So now the teachings are expanding. Out comes the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. And as we continue, there are more and more publications, more and more documentation of the practices of yoga. The Hatha Yoga Pradipika actually brings in like 16 asanas, most of those asanas being different, or postures being different versions of lotus or meditation posture. But we have a couple other ones and some breath practices in there, some pranayama. There are some mantras, some affirmations to say, and the practice gets deeper. More and more people get on board until eventually we come to around 1899, where there's a man named Krishnamacharya, and he is the father of modern yoga. He starts a school, the School of Mysore, the Mysore School of Yoga in India. And he starts to train people, but these people are young boys, right? They go to school to learn yoga, not just the asanas, but everything about yoga. And so these young boys really start to develop the asana practices or the postures. So you have to think that these are young kids with flexible bodies, flexible bones that are uber stretchy, that are learning how to form their bodies into these shapes. Aesthetic yoga, to look a certain way, because they can mold their bodies to look that way, right? And from Krishnamacharya comes our founding forefathers of modern yoga, of Western yoga. We have Iyengar. Iyengar is actually Krishnamacharya's nephew. Nephew? Yeah. Iyengar is sick. He's got tuberculosis. He has severe scoliosis of his spine. He's 28 years old, and he keeps bugging Krishnamacharya to let him into the school. And they're all like, no, you're too old. You're too sick. So eventually, his wife, because I think it's his sister, so maybe it was his brother-in-law. Anyways, maybe it was his aunt. Anyways, the wife of Krishnamacharya eventually talks him into letting Iyengar go. And Iyengar goes and he's like, how are you going to do this? So this is where props come from, because Iyengar can't practice the same way as these young boys. So he fashions blocks and straps to help him. And he continues to practice, and he's cured of his TB, and he's cured of his scoliosis. And so what we learn is also the physical benefits of the postures. And this is taken to all of the students. Now they start naming them. Many people within India are taught, like, you need to have a professional career, right? If the ability or the ability for people to be doctors and engineers and lawyers and scientists is there in the caste system, then those people continue. So a lot of these things are backed up, in which they're doing studies to prove how yoga really does help people physically. And so that's Iyengar. So he comes to the West, he comes to New York, and he brings props, teaching people how to find alignment first, because now he's teaching adults, not children, adults that don't have flexible bodies, how to get into these flexible positions. So there's Iyengar. He creates restorative, which allows everybody to experience the benefits of yoga, the benefits of the postures, for their own well-being and health. We have Pattabhi Jois as one of those founding forefathers. Pattabhi Jois is actually Krishnamacharya's son. Apparently, he's in the school. He's just a total little brat the whole time, not really paying attention. But he becomes a physician, and he ends up offering Ashtanga yoga. So a very disciplined practice that is kids yoga, right? If you know anything about Ashtanga, you know that there are series and that you can find a poster that you can put up on the wall that is the different postures that create the series. Well, it was so that you could put it up on the wall so the kids could come into class and practice without a lot of direction. And instead, the instructors that offered Mysore practice, so practicing on your own, would come and support the students in getting deeper into the posture. So it was also a very aesthetic practice. So when you've got 40-year-olds coming in after working a desk job their whole life, trying to make their body look a certain way, this can actually be very damaging. So this is why Ashtanga holds, it's a very strong practice, very disciplined practice, but it also holds a lot of injury within it because people push too hard. Then we move to Anya Devi, who is from Latvia, and her name is Eugenia Patterson. I'm doing this all off of memory. I don't have my notes in the background. And so she comes, I mean, she's a white woman first and foremost, okay? And she is well positioned financially. She comes from a powerful family, and her family is linked to the royal family of India. So when she comes, like everybody laughs, like you're a woman, you're not getting into yoga. But she gets her family to call in a favor with the royal family, and the royal family basically tells Krishnamacharya, like, you're going to train her. And so she comes in and she starts practicing yoga, and essentially she comes up or invents the yoga mat. And she takes all of her teachings and all of her practice and she takes it to Los Angeles, and she becomes the yogi guru to the stars. And she lives well into like 80s, 90s, or maybe even makes it to 100. And then finally we move to Desikachar, who is Kripalu Yoga, where he, I believe, also is a physician. He creates a yoga that's more independent to each person and their own physical needs. And so all of these people make their way to the West and they create very foundational roots for modern yoga that then branches off into many, many branches. And now we're in a postmodern yoga era where it's very interesting how it's come over to North America and Europe and has been prevalently blah, 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 has really been known for the studio practice where you go, you don't breathe, you don't meditate, you don't chant. It's all weird. We just want to move as quickly as we possibly can. And that's what we're offering for yoga. And so when yoga is brought up, like I teach yoga, it is interesting for me to see or experience what people know as yoga. So this is where we started with a little bit of history. I hope that it helps you to go a little bit deeper. We start to involve women, and now yoga is prevalently female. Most of us that are practicing are women. Though there are men, there's just not even close to as many men practicing as there are women. Well, that's what I've got for you today. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really excited to dive in way deeper and share so much more about my journey through yoga. And I look forward to seeing you in the next podcast. So thanks for listening. Bye. Thank you for joining me on Yoga is Science. I hope today's episode offered you a fresh perspective on the incredible synergy between the ancient yogic practices and our modern day science. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who could benefit from these insights. And until next time, keep exploring the science of life.